Hello everyone, welcome to my tutorial. We already talked much about the servlet and the servlet API. We talked about some of the important classes such as the generic servlet and the HTTP servlet. We also talked about the interface servlet. Now we need to talk about the servlet config and servlet context. These are the two important things in servlet API. And we need this because let's say you would like to connect your web application to a backend database. So what we need to do, we need to initialize it at the very first time. And we need to keep some of the parameters throughout the application. How do we do that? We do that during the startup of the web application. And that is through the servlet config and servlet context. So both are created at the time of the servlet initialization and provides initial parameter and initialization parameters. And these parameters we are going to keep all along the application is there. Okay. Now the servlet config provides initialization to a specific servlet and information public only for that servlet, while servlet context shares information to all servlets. So remember one thing, we are talking about the initialization parameter, but when it comes to servlet config, the initialization parameter is only public to that particular servlet, not for all other servlets. But when we define something on the servlet context, these initialization parameters will be shared or will be accessible by all of the servlets in the web application. So that is the main difference. Now let's move on to the next slide, and we are going to talk about the servlet context listener. So what is this? This receives the notification about a change in servlet from servlet context event. They work in pair. So the servlet context event notifies the listener. So DB connection or some other initial parameter can be loaded to servlet context during server startup because the servlet gets notifies about the first startup. So now we talked about the initialization parameter. So how do we initialize these parameters? So there are two ways to do that. One is the annotation. So annotation is in Java, it starts with the @ parameter, @ sign, and represents metadata information about something. Okay, such as the web servlet is an annotation to define a servlet component in a Java web application. So that means if you would like to define something, a servlet, then we have to put that web servlet as the annotation. So that means the application knows that this class or this Java file is a servlet which is acting as a web servlet. So one of the way that we set our initialization parameters is through the annotations, and the other one is a web.xml. So remember we talked about the web.xml, which is residing just below the webinf directory. Okay, and these holds all the different parameters. So now if you look at over here, the servlet, there are two tags, main tags. One is the servlet and there is the closing one, and the other one is the context param, and then there is the closing one. So in the servlet you can see that servlet name login controller, and then servlet class is you have to define where the package is or where the actual servlet is, and then you have the init parameters or init params. Okay, and then you have the param name, page name, and then param value, and this is the value. So this is coming as a, so I have to write it over here. Okay, so I have to, so you can see that this is the servlet name, and this parameter, this initialization parameter, is only applicable for this login controller servlet. Okay, there can be many other servlets, but this key value pair is applicable only for this one. And then you can see over here the context param, and the param name is global. Again, there is a spelling mistake. Global, and the value is global. Okay, and this name value thing, okay, or name value pair is applicable for all servlets in the web application. Now, which one is better, annotation or web.xml? It's a programmer's choice, but we can say that we can use annotation to set init parameters, but it has some drawbacks. Recompilation is needed for any change in initialization parameters. On the other hand, the change in web.xml just need a restart of the server. Okay, so if we do a change in the annotation, that means we change the Java file, and the change can only be reflected when we recompile it and redeploy it. But on the other hand, web.xml file change is not a change in the database. We have to just restart the server. Okay, so that's all for this tutorial. Thank you.